Before dawn had fully broken twice, one of Israel's most decorated combat formations was reported to have walked into a battlefield built for its destruction. In the hills of southern Lebanon, the Golani Brigade entered a lethal environment shaped not in days or weeks, but over roughly 2 decades of underground preparation. What followed, according to battlefield accounts and regional reporting, may mark one of the most consequential episodes of the current confrontation. To understand the scale of the shock, consider the comparison that immediately surfaced in military circles. During the Lebanon War of 2006, Israel lost 121 soldiers over 34 days of continuous fighting. Reports tied to the March 2026 clashes in southern Lebanon suggested losses on a scale that, in one sector and in less than 48 hours, approached many times that wartime benchmark. This was not described as a strike against unprepared civilians or an accidental collapse of a front line. It was presented as a collision between highly advanced conventional military power and a deeply layered underground defense system designed to reduce that power's advantages. If those assessments hold, the implications extend far beyond one brigade, one town, or one border. The first sign that something larger had happened did not come from a triumphant announcement or a rapid official briefing. It came from silence. For hours after the scale of the losses began to circulate, the Israeli government offered little public detail. And in the language of military reputation, that kind of silence can speak loudly. Governments that believe they have secured a clear success usually move quickly to define the narrative. Governments confronting an event they do not yet fully understand often pause, assess, and withhold. That pause became the first signal for many analysts that something historically significant may have taken place beneath the soil of southern Lebanon. At almost the same moment, a second pressure point emerged on an entirely different front. Iran formally presented a compensation demand of $270 billion addressed to both Israel and the United States. The figure, extraordinary in scale, amounted to more than half of Iran's annual gross domestic product by many estimates. Tehran's message was framed not only in military terms, but in economic and legal language. The demand was presented as compensation for destruction linked to the wider conflict, including reported damage to refineries, ports, and civilian infrastructure. Whether enforceable or not, it functioned as a strategic signal. The cost of escalation would not be counted only in missiles and casualties. 2 fronts were therefore moving at once. One was physical, close, subterranean, and violent. The other was legal, diplomatic, and economic, aimed at raising the price of continued confrontation for Washington and Tel Aviv. To understand how that convergence took shape, the timeline has to move back several weeks. In February 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign targeting Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. The operation was described by regional observers as one of the most ambitious and far-reaching actions in the history of that shadow war. Among the most dramatic claims surrounding that phase of the conflict was the reported elimination of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei by Israeli action. If accurate, that single event would represent a rupture unlike anything seen in the modern history of the Islamic Republic. It would also help explain the speed and intensity of the regional response that followed. Iran's network of allied armed groups did not react gradually. Hezbollah, widely regarded as Tehran's most capable non-state military partner in the eastern Mediterranean, moved rapidly from intermittent rocket fire to sustained bombardment against multiple targets in northern Israel. What began as retaliation soon developed into a widening escalation that neither side appeared able to fully control. Israel answered with a doctrine it had relied on before: overwhelming air power, large-scale mobilization, and the use of technological and intelligence superiority to shape the battlefield. Within weeks, 5 full divisions had reportedly been activated, and a new ground campaign, known as Operation Second Shield, moved into Lebanese territory. At the center of that push stood the Golani Brigade, identified as a spearhead force for the advance. On paper, the assumptions behind that choice were clear. Golani was not a routine infantry unit, but one of the best-known formations in the Israeli military, often mentioned alongside elite Western combat units for its combat history and reputation. Superior training, superior intelligence, and superior equipment were expected to remain decisive. But according to the emerging picture from southern Lebanon, that confidence may have rested on a critical miscalculation. The battlefield waiting beneath the surface was not temporary, improvised, or lightly defended. It was the product of long-term engineering, concealment, and preparation directed toward a single objective: forcing a technologically superior army into a form of combat where many of its advantages would disappear. Iran, meanwhile, was moving along a second track. The $270 billion compensation demand was presented with striking specificity, suggesting a number calculated to project seriousness rather than mere symbolism. Iranian officials and aligned commentators framed it as a record of measurable losses, not political theater. At the same time, the wider war revived an old debate about visible destruction and hidden capability. What satellites captured across Iran during the Israeli campaign may not have reflected the full extent of Iran's surviving military infrastructure. Analysts pointing to facilities such as Eagle 44 argued that deeply buried and hardened complexes were built precisely to absorb strikes while preserving operational continuity. That same logic of concealment appears to have shaped Hezbollah's preparations in southern Lebanon. The word tunnel is often used, but by most accounts, it no longer captures the scale of what had been built. What existed below the ground was described less as a tunnel system and more as an underground military city. The network reportedly included command posts, ammunition storage, field medical stations, escape shafts, lateral movement corridors, and communication routes stretching across dozens of kilometers. Some access points were allegedly hidden inside ordinary shops and civilian buildings that had operated for years without drawing meaningful attention. One reported command site functioned beneath a clothing store in a commercial district, a location that conventional targeting systems had not treated as a military asset. That level of concealment matters because it points to a structural challenge, not just a temporary tactical surprise. Modern intelligence systems are powerful when the target behaves like a visible military target, and they become far less effective when the battlefield has been buried, disguised, and broken into compartments over many years. The Golani Brigade entered that environment with the confidence of a force that had known repeated success. These were experienced troops, supported by some of the most sophisticated military hardware in the region. But at roughly 25 meters below the surface, inside reinforced rock and concrete, air power became almost irrelevant. The F-35 aircraft overhead could observe broad terrain, but they could not reach enemies hidden behind layers of earth. Precision-guided weapons costing hundreds of thousands of dollars each could not strike what they could neither clearly identify nor physically penetrate. Merkava Mark IV tanks, among the most advanced armored vehicles ever built, faced conditions where the battle space collapsed from kilometers to mere meters. In that underground world, the value of expensive hardware fell sharply. Combat narrowed into short-range engagements, shaped by familiarity with the terrain, discipline under pressure, and the ability to move through darkness without hesitation. There, Hezbollah's Radwan force was waiting. These fighters were not being described by their supporters as irregular guerrillas relying on instinct alone. They were portrayed as men who had studied Israeli tactics for years, prepared to kill zones in advance, memorized routes physically rather than theoretically, and built fallback systems for ammunition, medicine, and communications. They knew every bend, shaft, and chamber because many of them had helped create them. Hezbollah's earlier strategic concept, often referred to as a plan for entering the Galilee, had imagined offensive action into northern Israel under the right conditions. The Israeli campaign of 2024, along with the killing of several senior Hezbollah commanders, appears to have altered that timeline. But according to regional assessments, it did not erase the infrastructure or the doctrine that had already been developed underground. The ceasefire period, spanning parts of 2024 and 2025, may have played a decisive role, while some Israeli analysts interpreted the lull as evidence of weakness or deterrence. Hezbollah appears to have used that time to rebuild methodically supply lines through Syria, recruitment pipelines, engineering work, and subterranean training, all reportedly continued beyond the reach of normal surveillance. That possibility gives the episode a historical echo, and the comparison made by many observers was to October 1973, when warning signs were underestimated until events on the battlefield forced a rapid reassessment. In both cases, the argument is not simply that intelligence was incomplete, but that institutional confidence may have shaped what leaders were willing to see. The symbolic center of this story is Bint Jbeil. In 2000, after Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon following 18 years of occupation, Hassan Nasrallah declared victory there before a euphoric crowd. In 2006, fighting through its streets became one of the bloodiest chapters of that war. In March 2026, history returned to the same town with even greater intensity. Israeli paratroopers from the 98th Division and Yashalom Special Forces reportedly moved to encircle the area. The strategy appeared coherent: avoid an immediate frontal assault, cut supply lines, enable civilian evacuation, and tighten control before reducing defensive positions. Armored units advanced along the main road and moved to within roughly 300 meters of the stadium associated with Nasrallah's earlier declaration. For a brief moment, the operation seemed to be unfolding according to plan. Then the ground itself became the main battlefield. Once elements of Golani descended into the tunnel network, they entered a combat zone designed to nullify the advantages that had shaped Israeli battlefield dominance for decades. Drone feeds saw rooftops, roads, and the visible surface. The real fight was taking place below. Pilots circling high overhead could do little for troops engaged in close-quarters combat in narrow passageways where targets appeared and vanished in seconds. The mismatch between battlefield design and battlefield expectation widened with every report. Tanks worth millions of dollars each were of little use in corridors measured not in open maneuver space, but in passages roughly 3 meters wide. In that setting, an assault rifle, a clear line of fire, and a superior understanding of the tunnel geometry could matter more than a national arsenal. The Radwan force was also shaped by experience beyond Lebanon. Many fighters had served in Syria, where years of combat hardened unit discipline and exposed them to urban, irregular, and fortified warfare. They were also reported to have received guidance from officers tied to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, adding another layer of planning and battlefield adaptation. Then came one of the most serious dimensions of the story, the intelligence gap. Israeli estimates had reportedly placed Hezbollah's combat strength in the southern sector at between 6,000 and 7,000 fighters. During the fighting, those estimates were said to have been revised upward, in some assessments, to between 18,000 and 25,000 active and prepared combatants. That is not a minor adjustment. It is the difference between confronting a difficult, localized defense and confronting a military ecosystem built over years beneath the line of sight of satellites, signals, intercepts, and human sources. If those revised numbers are close to reality, then the failure was not only tactical, it was systemic. The combat itself, as described by veterans and regional sources, reached a level of intensity rarely seen in recent conflicts involving Israel. Ambushes emerged from vertical shafts and hidden side passages not marked on available maps. Pre-sighted kill zones directed advancing troops into crossing fires from multiple angles. Inside those passages, darkness, dust, echo, and compression altered every instinct. Sound became misleading. Direction became uncertain. Communications and night vision equipment reportedly suffered in the dense, humid, particle-filled environment. The battle reverted to something brutally direct. Men confronting men in spaces where half a century of technological advantage could no longer function as intended. Iranian analyst Mohammad Marandi has argued that Western powers repeatedly confused technological superiority with strategic superiority. His broader point is that wars are often decided not by the most expensive weapon, but by the side with the longer political patience. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, that framework has become central to how Tehran appears to read this conflict. In that view, the United States plans within electoral cycles, while Iran and its partners plan across decades. The compensation demand, therefore, is not only about money, it is also about establishing a precedent and reinforcing the message that external military action will produce long-term economic and political liabilities, not only immediate battlefield responses. This logic becomes more potent in wars of attrition. Democratic governments face rising domestic pressure as casualties mount and objectives remain unclear. Authoritarian or highly centralized systems often calculate that they can absorb pain longer than open societies can tolerate uncertainty. The historical comparison that inevitably returns is Vietnam. The United States inflicted immense destruction over many years, yet still failed to secure a politically sustainable outcome. Iranian and Hezbollah strategists appear to believe that lesson still holds. Victory does not require defeating a stronger opponent outright, only denying that opponent a result it can present as acceptable. By that standard, every additional Israeli casualty matters beyond the battlefield itself. Each loss strengthens public scrutiny, deepens political division, and raises the price of continuation. The Golani Brigade's reported experience in Bint Jbeil therefore carries significance that extends well beyond the brigade. Markets reacted quickly as reports of the losses began to spread. Brent crude reportedly jumped by roughly $17 per barrel within 48 hours as traders reassessed the likelihood of prolonged regional escalation. The speed of that move revealed how tightly military shocks in the Levant are now tied to global pricing expectations. The Eastern Mediterranean, which carries a meaningful share of global trade, moved into a higher risk category almost immediately. Maritime insurance premiums for cargo vessels near Lebanese waters reportedly tripled within a week, according to industry data cited in financial reporting. Investors also began reassessing infrastructure exposure across the Levant, including projects in Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. That means the consequences of the battle are not confined to a military map. They are already affecting boardrooms in Shanghai, banks in Frankfurt, insurers in London, and trading desks in New York. When a battlefield can disrupt energy prices, shipping routes, and investment models at once, it becomes a strategic event in the fullest sense. Washington now faces a difficult question it has long postponed. If Israel, with deep American backing and access to some of the world's most advanced military technology, cannot secure a decisive result against Iranian-aligned forces prepared for this exact confrontation, what does that say about American deterrence more broadly? The question is uncomfortable because it does not stay in the Middle East. It reaches eastward toward Taiwan, South Korea, and other allies whose security assumptions rest in part on the credibility of American power. It also reaches inward into strategic institutions now forced to reckon with the limits of systems that dominate open battlefields but struggle in subterranean ones. The issue is not whether American power has vanished. It is whether its most expensive advantages can be neutralized by adversaries willing to fight on entirely different terms. This is why many analysts see the southern Lebanon clashes not as an isolated tactical episode, but as a warning about doctrine itself. Air superiority has defined Western military confidence since the Second World War. Yet underground warfare exposes a domain where that superiority may have sharply reduced value. Fifth-generation aircraft become marginal if the enemy is buried too deeply to target. Heavy armor loses much of its meaning in tunnels, only a few meters wide. Satellite communications, advanced sensors, and electronic intelligence all weaken against forces operating beneath roughly 25 meters of earth and reinforced concrete. That is not just a local military lesson. North Korea, with its extensive tunnel systems, is almost certainly studying every available detail. China, as it examines contingency scenarios involving Taiwan and hardened defensive terrain, is watching as well. So are other states and non-state actors looking for ways to offset the conventional advantages of richer, more technologically advanced opponents. Hezbollah does not need a conventional victory in the traditional military sense to claim success from this phase of the war. It needs only to prove that it cannot be defeated at a political cost acceptable to Israel and the United States. In long conflicts, endurance itself becomes a weapon. Every day that a powerful conventional force remains bogged down in terrain chosen by its enemy shifts the strategic balance, even if maps do not change dramatically. Every additional casualty, every delayed objective, and every widening economic ripple increases pressure for negotiation. Iran's compensation demand adds a diplomatic and financial dimension to that same strategy. Taken together, military attrition, underground, and economic pressure above ground form a coordinated model of asymmetric warfare. One front drains blood, time, and confidence. The other raises legal, political, and financial costs while narrowing the space for escalation. The men of the Golani Brigade did not appear to enter a loosely defended pocket of resistance. They entered a battlefield shaped by patience, engineering, and a long strategic horizon. What happened beneath southern Lebanon was not only a violent clash, it was the visible expression of a transformation that may have been building quietly for a generation. The old assumption was simple: superior force, superior intelligence, and superior technology would eventually produce a decisive outcome. The message from Bint Jbeil is more unsettling. Against an adversary that chooses the terrain, buries the battlefield, and prepares for years beyond the reach of easy detection, that assumption may no longer hold. And that is why the silence from Jerusalem mattered so much. It suggested not only grief or caution, but recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Sometimes the battlefield speaks before governments do, and in southern Lebanon, the ground itself may have delivered the message first,